Rich woman awakens at her own funeral and hears shocking confession from husband and lover. The mansion, the dream house, was enveloped in somber mourning, but the opulence of the place was still impressive. White and lilac flowers adorned every corner, creating an unexpected contrast with the atmosphere of sadness that permeated the surroundings. The guests, dressed in their finest gala attire, gathered in small circles, sharing looks of condolence and whispers of despair. It was a luxurious funeral. Farewell that many deemed worthy of a powerful woman like Maria Sanchez. At the center of that scene, Maria's coffin stood out, gleaming and imposing, surrounded by floral arrangement. John, her husband, stood next to the coffin, his expression a mask of controlled pain. Tears streamed down his face. There was a furtive glint in his eyes that betrayed his facade of mourning. As he received the condolences from those present, his gaze often drifted toward Emily, the lover hiding among the guests, like a disguised shadow. Maria Sanchez's family had been wealthy for generations, with a legacy of success that positioned her as one of the most influential women in high society. Despite all the power and prestige, her marriage to John had been strained for some time. Maria suspected he was with another woman, picking up the subtle signs of betrayal that had accumulated over the months. However, the idea of ending the relationship had never been an option for her. Maria was a devoted mother and, above all, wanted to preserve her family for the sake of Sophia, a young daughter. She believed that even amid the difficulties and suspicions that tormented her, maintaining family unity was the most important thing. "She did so much for us," said a woman next to John, wiping her eyes with a silk handkerchief. "It's an irreparable loss." "Yes," John replied, his voice choked. His gaze was fixed on Emily, who smiled subtly at him, as if they shared a secret that no one else could imagine. She was always a fighter. As classical music filled the air, a soft melody meant to bring comfort, Maria found herself in a state of confusion. What was this place? What had happened to her? Slowly she began to feel her body again. The senses awakened, one by one, and the first thing she noticed was the strong smell of wilted flowers, mixed with the odor of wax from the lit candles. Something was very wrong. With an almost superhuman effort, Maria opened her eyes. The vision was blurry, and the light penetrating the coffin blinded her. Her heart raced. Where was she? What was happening? The voices around her began to become clearer, and the pain of confusion turned into panic. She was inside a coffin, surrounded by flowers and murmurs of lament. She was always so but the truth is that, deep down, we all knew she couldn't go on like this. "Do you think anyone suspects?" Emily asked with a tone of worry that sounded ironic to Maria. "If the police find out she's still alive?" "Don't worry," John replied in a whisper that was almost conspiratorial. "No one will find out. Everything is under control." The words cut like a sharp knife. Maria was paralyzed, trapped in her own wooden prison, while the man she loved spoke about her as if she were merely an object to be discarded. Betrayal and pain surged through her like a powerful wave, and she fought against the confusion that engulfed her mind. John and Emily were conspiring at her expense, and the truth was beginning to reveal itself. Even though she was trapped in her coffin, the music played in the background. For Maria, the sound was becoming increasingly distant. She needed to break free, needed to understand what was happening. With each word she heard, the desire to escape grew. What else had they planned? Maria's breathing became irregular as despair enveloped her. The life she knew was crumbling. "What if she wakes up?" Emily asked with a nervous laugh. "That would be a nightmare." "It's not going to happen," John assured her, and a satisfied smile formed on his lips. "Now, let's focus on what comes next." His final words echoed in Maria's mind as despair transformed into fierce determination. She couldn't allow this to be the end. Maria Sanchez felt her heart race and her mind spin as she tried to comprehend the situation she was in. The air was scarce and the space around her confined. The coffin, with its polished wooden walls and white satin lining, felt like a prison. The voices that reached her were distorted, as if an invisible veil filtered the words of her guests. But still, some phrases leaped like needles into her consciousness. "She was so amazing. A remarkable businesswoman," a woman murmured, while tears streamed down her pale face. "And to think it all ended like this," a man added, his voice choked with emotion. Maria wanted to scream, wanted to wave her arms, but the lack of control over her own body was an unbearable weight. She felt like a puppet with no strings, trapped in a performance she couldn't participate in. The husband. The love of her life, or so she thought. He was there, surrounded by friends and acquaintances, but his gaze, contrary to what Maria expected, did not convey pain, but rather a coldness that left her even more distressed. He can't be doing this, she thought, disbelief gnawing at her inside. And then Emily's voice penetrated her mind. You don't need to worry, John. Once this is all over, we'll be free. Her words were like poison, and Maria felt bile rise in her throat. Free herself? What did that mean? Pieces began to fit together slowly, but the assembled image was so horrible that Maria hesitated to accept it. I just hope no one suspects, Mistress continued, her voice low and whispering. Her inheritance is ours now. Maria couldn't believe what she had heard. Emily's ambition was monstrous, but what shook her the most was John's betrayal. The man who had promised to love her until the end was now complicit in this charade. The weight of betrayal crushed her. We need to act quickly, before anyone realizes she isn't coming back, John replied, his voice heavy with a determination Maria never imagined she would hear. From now on, all we need to do is keep up appearances. The coldness in his words felt like an echo of her own death, confirming that he didn't truly love her. Maria fought against the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. She needed to get out of there. The thought of remaining trapped in this coffin, listening to her husband and his mistress's treacherous plans, was unbearable. With each word, with each new revelation, she felt more determined to reverse her situation. When she is buried, we can finally live the life we've always dreamed of, Emily said, and Maria felt a surge of anger and indignation. The life they dreamed of? That was her life, the life John had promised to share. A life that was now being usurped before her eyes. With colossal effort, Maria tried to move her fingers, but the weight of the coffin and the emotional pressure kept her trapped. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, but she knew she couldn't give up. The force of betrayal, the need for justice, and the determination to reclaim her life pulsed within her like a deafening scream. She wasn't going to let this be her end. Not like this. Maria Sanchez, still trapped in her coffin, listened with growing disbelief to the whispered conversation between John and Emily, the mistress, whispering words of consolation that were merely to maintain appearances. Sophia, Maria's daughter, a girl of only 10 years, tried to approach her mother's coffin once more. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and the black dress seemed too large for her fragile body. She wanted to feel her mother's presence, even if just for a brief moment, and perhaps find some solace in the sight of Maria's serene face. Dad, can I get closer to Mommy? Sophia asked timidly, tugging at the sleeve of John's jacket with trembling fingers. Her voice was a barely audible whisper amidst the murmur of the attendees. John, distracted by the whispered conversation he was having with Emily, abruptly turned to the girl. His eyes sparkled with impatience and irritation, as if her presence was a personal affront. How many times do I have to tell you not to interrupt, Sophia? He growled, his voice low and threatening. Go to your room and stop wandering around here like a ghost. Sophia stepped back, shocked and with teary eyes. The pain of losing her mother was unbearable, and her father's harshness only made everything worse. She wanted to protest, to explain that she just wanted to say a final goodbye to her mother, but fear silenced her. But Dad, I just wanted, she started, voice trembling, almost inaudible. You just wanted to embarrass me in front of all these guests. John interrupted, his voice rising enough for those nearby to hear clearly. You're being an unbearable and inconvenient child. Go to your room now. The eyes turned to Sophia, and she felt the weight of humiliation crash down on her like a crushing wave. Shame and sadness mixed together, and she ran toward the stairs, tears streaming down her pale face. Each of her sobs was a dagger to the hearts of those watching the scene. Powerless. Don turned to Emily, his face taking on a calculated coldness. After we get custody of her, I'm sending her to a school in another country, said, not hiding the disdain in his voice. I can't stand this girl's nuisance anymore. Emily smiled conspiratorially, her eyes sparkling with malice. You're right, John. She needs discipline and distance. It will be better for all of us." As the two exchanged knowing glances, a low, distinct sound began to emerge from the center of the room. Maria's coffin started to move slightly. The murmurs of the guests grew in intensity, their eyes fixed on the coffin that, incredibly, was beginning to open. Maria, with superhuman effort, slowly rose from the coffin, her eyes locked on John and Emily. Shock and horror spread across the faces of everyone present. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of the coffin lid opening completely. "You will not touch my daughter," Maria said, her voice firm and resolute, resonating like thunder in the stunned room. Her face was pale, but her eyes shone with fierce intensity. The entire hall fell silent, and all eyes turned to the woman who had just resurrected from her own funeral. John took a step back, stumbling over his own words as he tried to process what was happening. "Maria, how?" stammered, panic evident in his voice. Emily, now pale and speechless, looked at John, searching for an explanation that could not be found. She stammered, But you died. How is this possible?" Maria, now completely out of the coffin, stood with a strength and dignity that only a determined mother could display. "I heard everything," she declared, her eyes fixed on John and Emily, "and I will not allow you to destroy my daughter's life." The impact of her words reverberated through the room as the guests exchanged glances, trying to comprehend the miracle they had just witnessed. Maria remained unshaken. The shock on the faces of her betrayers was the reward she had been waiting for. "I did not die. I was betrayed, but now I am here to claim what is mine. And believe me, I will not let you get away with this." The weight of her words echoed in the room, and the atmosphere was thick with tension. She felt a mix of adrenaline and rage, every part of her pulsing with the need for justice. The murmur of the guests intensified, and panic began to take hold of the environment. But Maria stood firm, determined to confront her tormentors. The truth was about to be revealed, and she would not back down. "And now, what are you going to do?" Maria challenged, looking into the eyes of John and Emily. The room was in an uproar, but for her, everything seemed to flow in slow motion. She was ready to face the truth, not just about them, but about herself. The room was in turmoil. Some people stepped back, while others murmured among themselves, confused and stunned. Maria felt she needed concrete evidence so that this revelation would not be just a declaration of pain, but a cry for justice. And at that moment, Detective Ramirez stepped forward from the crowd. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice firm and authoritative, "but I have something to say." He approached Maria with a look that mixed respect and determination. "Maria, I have been investigating your death, and I have evidence showing that John and Emily were involved." The murmurs intensified, and Maria saw the shocked faces. "Evidence?" John repeated, his voice trembling, trying to maintain the facade of control. "You can't do this, Ramirez. There's nothing against me." "Yes, there is," the detective replied, pulling an envelope from his folder. "Recordings, testimonies, everything. You thought you could escape this forever. The truth always comes to light." He turned to the guests. This woman was not dead. She was murdered by those who were supposed to love her. Detective Raul Ramirez stood at the edge of the funeral commotion, carefully observing every movement inside the mansion. The dream house. Although he was appropriately dressed for the occasion, in a dark suit with a somber expression that matched the atmosphere, his mind was completely focused on the investigation that had brought him there. Months earlier, Maria Sanchez, powerful and shrewd businesswoman, secretly hired him. She had suspected her husband's behavior, John. Financial transactions he had been making, withdrawing large amounts from her fortune without a plausible explanation, had raised Maria's suspicions. Don had always, Ramirez, known for his ability to unravel even the most complex mysteries, took on the case, aware that it would not be a simple task. For weeks, he tracked John's movements, observing every suspicious action and scouring his finances for irregularities. Then, he found what Maria feared. John was embezzling money, and worse yet, was involved with another woman. Emily, the mistress, was complicit with John, and the two were plotting something much larger than mere theft. Ramirez had gathered enough evidence to expose John's betrayal, but before he could present the complete dossier to Maria, something terrible happened. His client, who had once been an energetic and vibrant woman, had passed away suddenly. News shook him deeply, but instead of abandoning the case, Ramirez felt compelled to continue the investigation. Something about her death seemed too strange, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. On the day of the funeral, Ramirez arrived early at the mansion, disguised as one of the many guests. He watched John and Emily throughout the ceremony, noticing that they maintained an unusual closeness, whispering to each other and exchanging furtive glances. But it was in a moment of carelessness that he overheard a revealing conversation. John cryptically mentioned something about getting rid of her before it's too late, which only confirmed the detective's suspicions. Ramirez had also discovered through deeper analysis that the night before Maria's death, John had administered a liquid in her meal, a chemical compound that induced a deep temporary stupor, simulating a heart attack. The plan was ingenious. Maria would be declared dead and buried as quickly as possible, before any more attentive doctor could notice something amiss. Now at the funeral, Ramirez knew he was faced with a Machiavellian scheme. He was there to confirm his final suspicions, and if necessary, take action before it was too late. John and Emily's nervous behavior during the ceremony only reinforced the detective's certainty they were desperate to wrap up the funeral quickly, to bury Maria before anyone realized she wasn't really dead. Ramirez was prepared for anything. He knew he needed concrete evidence and an opportunity to expose the truth. His hand discreetly rested on the recorder in his pocket, ready to capture any new evidence. But he was also aware that time was against him, and against Maria. Every passing second could mean the difference between saving a life and condemning it to a horrific end. When Maria began to move in the coffin, causing a commotion among the guests, Ramirez knew the moment had arrived. He was in the right place at the right time to ensure that justice was served. Maria felt a wave of relief mixed with the anger boiling inside her. "Did you think you could silence me? That I wouldn't come back to seek justice?" She looked at John and Emily, who were now surrounded by accusatory stares. "You're not getting away with this. Not while I'm alive." Emily, realizing the situation was deteriorating, tried to shift the focus. "This is crazy. You can't arrest me for this. I'm innocent," she shouted, but her desperation only served to corroborate the guilt Maria knew existed. "You're not innocent, Emily," Maria stated, her eyes locked on her husband's lover. "You're an accomplice, and the truth always prevails." The atmosphere in the room was electric, charged with tension and fear. John, realizing his trap was collapsing, tried to distance himself, but Ramirez's presence stopped him. "You're not going anywhere, John," the detective said firmly. "The police are already on their way." Chaos reigned in the main room of the mansion, the dream house. The screams of horror and shock from the guests echoed off the walls as Maria Sanchez, risen from her own coffin, faced John and Emily with an expression of pure determination. The shock on John's face quickly morphed into panic, while Emily seemed unable to process what was happening. Before either of them could react, Detective Ramirez, who had remained on the sidelines, stepped forward to the center of the scene. "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to remain calm. I am Detective Ramirez, and I am here to ensure that the truth is revealed." Ramirez pulled out a series of documents and recordings he had brought with him, evidence he had carefully gathered throughout his investigation. "John Sanchez, you are under arrest for attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy to embezzle funds." The murmurs among the guests grew in intensity as two police officers, who had been discreetly called by Ramirez before the funeral, moved in to handcuff John. Emily tried to back away. Maria's piercing gaze kept her in place. "Emily, you are also under arrest as an accomplice," Ramirez announced, his voice firm. "You both conspired to kill Maria, attempting to stage a murder as a heart attack, all to claim her fortune." The two were handcuffed and forcibly taken away by the officers, their protests and attempts to deny falling on deaf ears. As they were led out of the mansion, John and Emily exchanged one last look, realizing their plan had failed miserably. The complicity they once shared was now turning into mutual desperation and betrayal. And so, in front of a room full of witnesses, Maria felt stronger than ever. She was no longer the woman who had been betrayed. She was a survivor, a woman who, after waking from the nightmare, was ready to fight and ensure that the truth was revealed. It was the beginning of a new life, and Maria would not allow anyone to hold her back. In the following months, the case made headlines. John and Emily were tried for attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The evidence presented by Ramirez, along with Maria's testimony, was irrefutable. Court listened in silence as each grim detail was revealed, from the embezzlement of funds to betrayal to the chemical compound used to simulate Maria's death. John, who tried to defend himself by claiming it was all a misunderstanding, saw his defense crumble as the evidence piled up against him. Emily, who initially tried to blame John, eventually admitted her guilt in a moment of desperation, hoping for a lighter sentence. In the end, the verdict was clear. Both were sentenced to long prison terms with no possibility of parole. John was sentenced to 25 years for attempted murder, conspiracy, and embezzlement. Emily received a 20-year sentence as an accomplice in the same crime. Life in prison was a nightmare for John and Emily. Separated and isolated, they were kept in different wings to avoid any contact. John, once a powerful and respected man, now spent his days in a cold and lonely cell, tormented by his mistakes and the hatred he felt for Emily, whom he blamed for the ruin of his plans. Emily, in turn, faced the harsh reality of isolation. She, who had been seduced by luxury and power, now lived in a simple cell where the weight of her actions crushed her daily. Friendship and complicity she and John shared had transformed into bitterness, resentment, and loneliness. As John and Emily faced their sentences, Maria, recovering from the trauma, decided to restart her life. The fortress of resilience that had kept her alive during the nightmare now guided her on a new path. She sold the mansion, the dream house, and moved to a quieter place, where she could focus on caring for her daughter, Sophia. Maria also decided to share her story with the world, not only to expose the betrayal of John and Emily, but to inspire others to fight for their lives and for justice. John and Emily's cruel plan had failed. The attempt to usurp Maria's life and fortune led them to ruin, and justice prevailed. While they spent their days in isolation, separated and bitter, Maria moved forward, rebuilding her life with the strength and dignity that had always been her greatest virtues. And you? How far would you go to protect your family? Comment below what you would do in Maria's place. If you like the content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. This helps the channel grow and bring new exciting stories. And turn on the bell to receive notification.